No.
Yes.
Okay, no problem. No, I'm 30 of them once in and so I did, you know, they well, I did. How do you know what it is?
All right, let's get this 4 p.m. show started. I'm Alicia Cohen, and I'm the director of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and I am delighted to welcome you all here. Thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Andrea Wenzel to Murphy Hall for her talk, Making Local News Anti-Racist. This is part of a program that we're having on balanced reporting and divisive times in the school. We thought about this many moons ago, and of course there's all sorts of reasons that our news is controversial, that we have issues of social unrest, and this is an important idea to think through what it means to have anti-racist journalism as part of our tools that we have in balanced reporting and thinking about being responsible. Andrea is an associate professor of journalism at Temple University's Klein College. Her new book is titled Anti-Racist Journalism, The Challenge of Creating Equitable Local News. And it comes out next Tuesday. She's also the author of Community-Centered Journalism, Engaging People, Exploring Solutions, and Building Trust. So she's been thinking a lot about the relationship between journalism and communities. And we are really fortunate to have her here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where we have a terrific and very vibrant community of reporters. A former journalist herself, Andrea's research focuses on initiatives to create a more connected and equitable community and community-connected newsrooms. She co-founded the Germantown Information Hub and has been a fellow with the Columbia University's Cho Center. Please help me welcome Dr. Wenzel. And one word about the format, we will let Dr. Wenzel give her talk. Then there'll be plenty of time for question and answers. So make sure to take a few notes and to get your questions ready. And we'll just kind of go around the room and let her answer some of those. And then we'll wrap up with a little reception. So if you're a little hungry at the end of the day, we've got some food for you down in Murphy 100 or a little bit after 5. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Wenzel. Thank you.
To get to be with you all today. Thank you so much for this kind welcome, and to be in a room with a lot of scholars whose work I admire and respect, and people doing work in this area whose work I admire and respect. So thank you so much for letting me be part of this series that you're doing. I'm going to share a little bit about this. Is also my very first book talk on this book, since it's coming out next week. So forgive me as I shake the rust off a little bit and like get my brain working. But I'll just start off with a little bit of context for how it kind of came about. I've been having a lot of conversations with people in different parts of the US in the past several years about what they would like a better relationship with local journalism to look like. And as part of that, I was hearing some themes around both harmful coverage and absent coverage. And in the examples that I have here from 2 residents in the Philadelphia area, were kind of illustrating how when I talked to a lot of people in majority Black neighborhoods, I heard a lot of frustration that their only encounter with journalists was when there was a moment of crisis, sort of the worst day of someone's life, and not other times. But then if I took just a short drive away and was in a majority white suburb, people had sort of internalized a sense that news was so much connected with the idea of negativity that they were kind of having a no news is good news feeling, even though they were basically living in a news desert. And the more I heard voices like this, the more I was thinking about the critical scholarship of somebody named George Lipsitz, who does a lot of work thinking about the racial coding of spaces and how it can really shape how we imagine our world. And you can end up having white spatial imaginaries that are completely separate Black spatial imaginaries, and that can incorporate other BIPOC communities as well, but that was just the framework he uses. And it made me think of how our understandings can be so incredibly incomplete as a result of this. And of course, the problematic nature of coverage in US journalism has to be thought of in the larger scope of the long history of harm that journalism has done to marginalized communities, particularly Black and Brown communities. Groups like Media 2070 have documented this extensively, and most journalism institutions were established by and for white people, and so this has shaped how journalism practices and norms have been defined. It's one of the reasons some norms like objectivity have been put into practice in ways that end up contributing to reporters overrepresenting people who are white and male or in positions of power. And while journalists have been encouraged, this also shaped how journalists have been encouraged to keep a distance from communities. And I have to say at the start that I've been part of the system. So I am a white former journalist, and I've worked in majority white news organizations where we would be doing reporting about communities of color, but for mostly white audiences. I used to work in public radio. And so I'll say that, from the beginning, I've had to be mindful of, what is my own positionality in this work? There's limits to what I can know and understand and say. I can't speak on behalf of journalists of color, but racism in journalism is a problem created by white people, and it's benefited us whether we want it to or not. And so I think it's incumbent on white people to also be involved in trying to address it in some way. And being mindful of that, we don't always get it wrong when we mess up, and we have to be as transparent about that as possible. So in many ways, this book is sort of building on some of what I was doing before, talking about community-centered journalism, having conversations with people, trying to reimagining how they could center the perspectives of community members. And for that, I had been looking at case studies where where we would try to understand what were the communication needs and assets of a community, and then co-designing with folks interventions to respond to them. And sometimes they turned into community journalism projects like the Germantown Info Hub. And those projects led me to make an argument for community-centered journalism that's produced with and for communities and centers both their needs and their assets as being something that I saw value in, and as a way to address some of the questions here at different points in the process of doing journalism, that you can think about how to be community-centered throughout the cycle of reporting, through the interviewing process, through the editing process, through how you interact with communities to share and get feedback on things. But while those community-centered interventions I was looking at were by and for communities were still being harmed by narratives being told about them as well. And that was from their experiences with mainstream news outlets. And so I wanted to also look at how larger news organizations could try to be less harmful. And I wanted to try to connect conversations about how newsrooms can engage communities with conversations that were happening about DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I wanted to explore those questions in the context of a metro system that is structurally interconnected. And so I focused on the system of Philadelphia, which is where I live, but it's also where there's been a lot of investment in local journalism. And it's an interesting place to explore initiatives that try to make local journalism more equitable and anti-racist. And so my book looks at several case studies of both established majority white news organizations as well as majority BIPOC journalism startups, and also just sort of looking at the structural characteristics of the system and how they can kind of either facilitate or present barriers to reimagining a more anti-racist local journalism. So I draw on a few different frameworks and concepts in this work. I'm not going to get into them, but I look at communication infrastructure theories, idea of local storytelling networks. I also bring in scholarship around whiteness and anti-racism, and I reference journalism studies scholarship about the influence of foundations and meta-organizations. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the methods that I used when I did this project. It's a series of case studies, and so there's observations, interviews, and focus groups. So just to give you a little context about Philly, where this research is situated, these are the largest demographic groups in Philadelphia by race. As you can see, it's 42% Black. These are maybe not them. I need to double check the recent. These are from when I wrote the book, but roughly what the population breakdown is. But when you look at the metro newsrooms that are set out to cover the city, it looks pretty different. So this was from WHYY, the public media station that I had started collaborating with back in 2018 when they wanted to do a source diversity audit. They wanted to look at who are the people they're talking to in their stories. And at the time, their newsroom was 80% white, and compared to about 40% of the community. Likewise, in 2020, when I co-led the Philadelphia Inquirer's Diversity and Inclusion Audit, about 75% of their newsroom at the time identified as white. And so I collaborated with both of these news organizations on different kinds of audits of who was in their coverage. And unsurprisingly, there were parallels between white voices being overrepresented in their newsroom and in their coverage. At WHYY, just like 80% of their staff were white, 80% of their sources were white. Similarly with the Inquirer, 61% of their stories were white compared with 41% of others. Sorry, 61% of the people in their stories were white. And so in both of these, I mean, those numbers were really not terribly surprising, but I wanted to understand what was behind them. How did these newsroom norms and practices and newsroom cultures contribute to overrepresenting white perspectives? And so I conducted interviews and observed the interventions that they tried to do in response to these audits. So at WHYY, they organized a series of cultural competency trainings, they called them, both for their staffs as well as for other journalists in Philly. And they talked in these a lot about trying to expand the diversity of their sources, trying to adjust their habits to build relationships with more people who identify as people of color or as women. And they also had tried to establish some internal accountability infrastructure. So they tried to think about things like, how can we keep doing source tracking on our own, have our reporters do it, and then also setting goals for that work as well as for community engagement work and putting it in people's annual reviews to try to make some sort of accountability. And they noticed some improvement as they tracked this. These are from a while back now, but they did notice that they were including more BIPOC sources in their programming, and their community engagement work expanded. They did a number of different initiatives. They had newsroom staff participate in community, like conversations with community members. They had some storytelling workshops with community members. And they did a number of different programs. But over time, this sort of shifted a bit, and the community engagement work got taken over by a new community engagement team. And this included a new project called the News and Information Community Exchange Project. And their goal was to, what they called it, a mutual aid network for local journalism. And partners had a range of different perspectives. They identified as grassroots content creators. They were podcasters, bloggers, different kinds of influencers, as well as more kind of traditional ethnic media producers. And they got a stipend. They had to go to weekly meetings, and they would share resources and talk about collaborations. Some of them ended up being featured as part of WHYY programming. This is an example that they talked about a lot as being a success story of this. This was one of the nice partners did an interview with a local gun violence activist who refused to talk to other media, but because she was from his community, as she put it, she like, we go to the same daycare, we go to the same bake. He had a sense of trust with her and was willing to talk with her. And in this respect, this nice project was opening up who got to be part of local journalism and also whose voices were heard and had access to their outlet. But one of the challenges that they faced and was sort of an overall barrier to WHYY's community engagement efforts was resources. And so numerous newsroom staffers complained that they just didn't have the staffing to do community engagement work. And they also noted that they felt a disconnect and a separation from the people who were doing that work. They felt a bit isolated from them. It was different people than the people doing the daily news. And then at the at the end of 2021, the person who was really the champion of this work, who was spearheading it, announced that she was leaving. And about that same time, the Inquirer did a story about like massive staff turnover at WHYY, and it quoted their CEO making some kind of controversial and dismissive comments. And following this, some of the cultural competency initiatives ended up being put on hold for a while. And it's sort of underlined the fragility of initiatives that are really dependent on an organizational champion as opposed to having sort of infrastructure built in. And I'll come back to that point, but I want to shift over to the Inquirer for a second. So the Philadelphia Inquirer, the daily newspaper in Philadelphia, got a lot of notoriety following the publication of this headline in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. This was about a story about how protests were affecting infrastructure, and this very unfortunate headline, "Buildings Matter Too," they later acknowledged was racist themselves, and it led to a big, a lot of backlash, both externally and among their own staff. The Journalists of Color organization set up they formalized themselves as an organization, and they made a lot of demands for what they wanted to see happen. It ended up leading to the resignation of their top editor and a massive diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative called Inquire for All. This ended up being a series of different working groups. It involved about 80 employees altogether, so it was big, and it involved people all across the newspaper. And at the same time, a group of us at Temple came together to put together an audit of the organization that I was co-leading. And this, I focused on the qualitative side. We did a bunch of interviews, and then 6 months later, we did a bunch more and some focus groups, and observed things that were happening along the way. And again, as I referenced before, like the quantitative findings were not too surprising. We knew that we were going to find people who identified as white being overrepresented, but the conversations that I got to have with people were really interesting to try to unpack how day-to-day practices and norms that privileged whiteness kind of came to be, and including how objectivity norms were interpreted. Things like who gets access to opportunities in the newsroom and who doesn't, things about journalism funding structures. So the combination of all of this contributed to the overrepresentation of white sources and the centering of an imagined white audience. And it wasn't necessarily something people were doing intentionally. It generally was not. But some of the ways it looked in practice were things like, so people saying that they weren't, there's a reluctance to have conversations openly about race. People didn't want to talk about it. There was a lot of challenges of journalists of color complaining that their editors were asking them to explain things that they wouldn't ask if they were covering a white community, for example, and an assumption that the editors were thinking always with the idea of a white readership in their minds. There also wasn't much of an understanding of what community engagement was or who should be doing it. And then of course there were workplace and equity issues, pay equity, a lot of things going on there. And then finally, there was just a kind of a negative, a sense that this was a reactive response, a kind of a distrust for the kind of the genuine nature of it, and just a lot of distrust between different groups in the organization. That said, so those were some of the challenges. Even before we did any work with the audit, there were lots of people trying to do things within this organization, individual journalists who had set up their own databases to try to find, have a list of sources of color who they could talk to, people who were doing community engagement work. but they were largely kind of doing it individually as they could. At around the time of the Inquire for All work and after our audit, they started several new initiatives at the institutional level. One of them was something called a content consult Slack channel that they talk about a lot, which was basically a pre-publication Slack space where they could talk about things that they thought might be problematic. It was kind of framed as a way of this will keep us from screwing up again, basically. And also a way to take some of the invisible labor off of BIPOC journalists who often had been unofficially asked to do sensitivity reads in the past. And so there were some, things about this that were constructive, but some journalists spoke of it as being of not working so well and actually potentially being a harmful space. So how it was implemented is still a little unclear. One of the more interesting efforts though was the Anti-Racist Workflow Guide, which tried to get journalists thinking about reflexive reporting and editing processes at different points in the journalistic process. And it focused on a lot of questions to encourage people to ask at different points in the process. Things like, who am I centering in the story? Some things were things that anyone could be grappling with, others were more job specific. But unfortunately, when I followed up with staffers, many noted that this guide wasn't really widely implemented, at least at the time. But that's another thing that they tried to tackle or said that they wanted to tackle was doing more community engagement initiatives and things like creating a community desk, creating community advisory boards, and holding accountability conversations. So far, the only thing that they've done is a community engagement desk. It took them a little while to get that off the ground, but they do have that now. And then internally, they tried to make their DEI work more sustainable to try to prevent burnout from all the labor they were asking of folks. At the same time, about a year into the work, their vice president for DEI left, and they've had some challenges maintaining that role. And sort of in that interim period, they had just a series of public challenges where they got called out for some of their shortcomings. There was multiple discrimination grievances, including this one that alleged that a Black staffer was paid less than a less experienced white staffer to do the same job. They also were called out by the head of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists for their lack of Black male reporters. And a new external accountability group was started called the Philadelphia Accountability Watchdog Network, or Philly John. John is like a slang term in Philly that I'm not going to try to explain. But so they put together this open letter. They called on the Inquirer, said, hey, we want to meet with you. They wanted to talk about their lack of DEI progress. But that was the publisher, did not reply to them directly, but there ended up being an internal email that was leaked, and it was, fairly hostile to Philly John. And a lot of people that I talked to, kind of reflected on this moment as sort of a lost opportunity, that there could have been a moment for dialogue and goodwill, but that did not happen. And it just got worse when the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, who is connected to John, presented them with a thumbs down award at their gala event where the Inquirer had bought a table, and they walked the award over to them. It's online. It's kind of remarkable. But so it's just sort of gotten more heated. And it the serious side of it is it suggests that there's not a willingness to publicly engage in a conversation about accountability with external critics. So with both of these organizations, interventions had areas of progress, but also big limitations too. I argue that their cases illustrate the need for accountability infrastructure. So setting up processes for goals to be incorporated in performance reviews, or having, very clearly defined standing committees with clear tasks were some things that they did. But the challenge was in a lot of these cases, things faltered when there was a lack of leadership or resources. a big challenge at both places was the lack of open dialogue about how to incentivize sharing power. Journalists at both places also, had issues around not having a vision for any sort of anti-racist business model, and sort of still thinking about wider, wealthier audiences as their default. And then for community members, it was never, talking with people, the issue is never necessarily just one organization, but a sense of the local news. And so there's also a requirement for local news to collaborate with each other to figure things out. But that was, there was some resistance to collaboration, particularly from the Inquirer. So those were some of the key takeaways from these two established majority white news organizations, to try to think about what accountability infrastructure can look like in this system. I also looked at two startup organizations where more than half of their staff at the time identified as BIPOC. These organizations weren't needing to do repair work so much as they could be doing reimagining work. And so, for example, the Resolve Philly is a journalism support group that was just started in 2017. And they have a number of different initiatives that try to make local journalism more equitable and accessible. The thing that I focus on in my book is their initiative to try to do a community wire service. I think now they're calling it the Community Information Network. It's changed a bit. But basically it's this idea of a network of hyperlocal bureaus that can be connected to each other. And so for right now, the Germantown Info Hub, they've actually adopted as one of their bureaus. But they're trying to see how they can kind of rethink what's possible from local journalism by investing in these storytellers who are closer to their neighborhood and to their community and shaping their own narratives. And so they're trying to create a sort of infrastructure for community-centered collaboration through that. The other case I looked at was Kensington Voice. It's a bilingual Spanish and English hyperlocal site, and they've been covering a different highly stigmatized neighborhood in Philadelphia. And they have the thing that I think is really interesting about them that I think other organizations, even larger ones, could take some ideas from, is they have a community-led board, not an advisory group, but a community-led board with governance powers. Which means that they can have oversight of budget, they can have oversight of leadership staff. And they involve them in a variety of ways. They have other ways they have community participation. They also do some kind of really unusual practices like participatory budgeting amongst their staff to talk about salaries. So they all sit down and they come to some sort of consensus about who gets paid what, and they change things accordingly. It's allowed them to do things like have bilingual pay rates for Spanish speakers, so they're not, doing unacknowledged invisible labor. But some of their practices, they're small and nimble, but they have some things that I think have some insights for even larger groups. And then finally, I looked at external meta organizations like funders, journalism support organizations, DEI consultants, because they were all playing a role in this space, and looked at how they could offer incentives and accountability pressures, but also how sometimes their interventions have unintended consequences, how sometimes they ended up bolstering legacy outlets or channeling resources to sort of larger players, and not always accounting for power dynamics. Philly is one of the most heavily resourced local news and information environments in the US. It's something like more than $50 per capita, according to a study that's now a bit old. I don't know what it is right now. So the Lenfest Institute is one of the biggest funders in the area for local journalism. And they were supporting a lot of DEI work, but it was complicated because they were also supporting the Philadelphia Inquirer because they own the Philadelphia Inquirer. There's a nonprofit owner. And so, some people who I spoke with were concerned that, the money that was going to the Inquirer, even though it was a significant amount of their budget, was kind of small potatoes for the Inquirer, and so wasn't really setting their agenda. But that same amount of money, if it was directed to a Black and Brown led organization, a smaller organization, could be transformative. But that's not what that the money, they argued, could be spent better that way. I also looked at some other structures for trying to have an external organization in a local journalism space, and one of them was what Charles Crittenden's been doing with the American Press Institute, where he'll get a cohort of news organizations in one place and have them, kind of collectively do training, consultation, and resource sharing, and require them to commit to having some transparency with the community before they agree to be part of this project. And so their inclusion index in Pittsburgh right now has been doing some interesting work in that regard, because it's the transparency piece that they do is something that was notably missing in Philadelphia. And then finally, I looked at some national efforts to try and pressure organizations to be more accountable in their DEI commitments, like the Public Media for All initiative. Some of the things that I appreciated from these was they were able to call for accountability for even the very tops of organizations in a way that is really challenging if you're working in that space. So multiple people that I talked to expressed a real frustration with CEOs who stuck around at news organizations for a long time, and an interest in things like having term limits for CEOs, or having community-led boards where non-management staff and community members could vote on who's on the board, and then who then could have oversight over leadership. So some of those ideas that were generated from initiatives like this, I think, were useful and could use more amplification. And this, the lack of accountability for top leaders of news outlets was something that so many people I talked to spoke about, but would only ever kind of like whisper about publicly. And including at these like organizations, large organizations. So it led me to conclude that there's a real need for meta organizations, funders, journalism support organizations to try to normalize a conversation around rethinking what good leadership for equitable journalism looks like. And I argue that this should also include, encouraging leaders who look like me to consider how we think about transitioning and to share power, how, being a good leader could be reframed not as how long you're at an institution, but how you transform that institution to be ready for something else. And this quote is actually from Sarah Alvarez at Outlier Media. It's talking about something a little different. It's talking about a legacy news outlet they were partnering with. But I thought this idea of trying to create value along the way, even if the structures are not in place, was sort of an interesting thing to think about. And then finally, another way meta organizations are influencing local journalism systems in Philly and in other cities around the US is through nationally funded efforts like City Bureau's Documenters project. So this project, some of you I'm sure are familiar, it pays and trains community members to document civic meetings, and that information gets shared in a place that's publicly accessible, and also journalists can use it. And this was something that in Philly was interesting because a lot of community members really wanted something like this. But when they came into Philly, they teamed up with Resolve Philly, which had by then become a sort of a bigger, almost a meta organization in its own right. Meanwhile, Kensington Voice, which was sort of a smaller group, had independently been trying to do a project almost like Documenters, but didn't even know Documenters was coming. And so it was sort of an awkward moment of like, oh, that's, there's the potential for that to be kind of a big footing situation. Fortunately, they're now collaborating, and Kensington residents are getting to participate in Documenters, so it's going to work out. But it illustrates how sometimes even unintentionally, these like really well-intentioned national organizations, when they're coming into a local system, there's a challenge of trying not to just end up supporting the system's dominant actors. They don't know all the power dynamics. So just trying to get towards wrapping up here. So the combination of interventions I looked at in Philly, this is I'm really, really bad at making these things. So I'm sorry. But I tried to think about how these interventions were affecting local storytelling networks, the the relationship between, I'm also not describing this theory well, but looking at the relationship between residents, community groups, and local media. So, you know, historically, Metro news outlets focus kind of on a one-way distribution of content to audiences, sometimes drawing ideas from community organizations and hyperlocals to get sources, but not really thinking about them as collaborators. And so in this sort of pre-intervention situation, the support from the meta organizations was mostly going to Metro media outlets. And then the diagram gets even worse. But so like after looking at these different interventions, there were some shifts. They were not necessarily even shifts, and for some organizations, not a lot changed. But for example, as a result of interventions that were, you know, trying to get more community engagement happening, some of those were supported by meta organizations, and some links that had before been like a one-directional link became a two-directional link as there were sort of more interaction. And I'll just end with a few recommendations that I share in the book for stakeholders of different kinds trying to make journalism more equitable and anti-racist. So thinking about standardizing community-centered journalism processes so that they're not siloed off in an organization, but that they could be integrated into just what it means to do good journalism. Thinking about creating accountability infrastructure internally across organizations, and that could be things like source tracking or forums to talk about content after it's published, performance review, like different kinds of things. It's more important how they're implemented than what they are. And just to clarify what I mean by accountability infrastructure, I'm talking about system structures or programs to facilitate holding stakeholders with more power responsible for listening to and addressing the needs and concerns of those with less. And these recommendations can kind of map onto this community-centered journalism cycle where you're looking at the different parts of the process of reporting. And so I kind of mapped out like how some of these DEI and engagement practices can kind of come at different points in that cycle of community-centered journalism, from reporting, editing to sharing stories. There's different opportunities to create accountability infrastructure within newsrooms, but also between newsrooms and communities. And then recommendations for meta organizations to really think about, can they normalize and incentivize conversations about reimagining governance structures to increase accountability, to consider things like transitional leadership, to think about that, how that could be a positive accomplishment, or think about things like community-led boards in a serious way, or term limits for executives. How external accountability, how news organizations could approach groups that are trying to hold them accountable with a bit more openness in a spirit of shared goals. In so many places, it's hard to find people who care enough about legacy news organization to complain even. So there's an opportunity to sort of think about how these organizations, how you can engage them in a constructive dialogue that can hopefully be beneficial, or create their own community accountability groups. And then collaborations is really thinking about equity issues and power dynamics within them. So some of these recommendations for accountability can be really challenging, but there are some projects that are already happening in this space. This is from a project that I've been involved with where we've been trying to experiment with community accountability groups, thinking about having accountability conversations where local media get feedback from the community members who are they've been covering. So it's not, there's bite-sized pieces that can be done and are being done. Likewise, this has become a very timely issue around funding, given sort of the market failure in journalism. There is a role for funders to try to push things towards greater equity. And I would just argue that there should be a shift of prioritizing BIPOC-centered and led organizations, that there can still be some work to try to assist, especially transformational BIPOC leadership in established organizations at critical moments. But the dynamic could shift And I don't think philanthropy can solve all of local journalism's problems, but there are some efforts right now that are notable, including the Press Forward initiative, which you may have encountered. It's $500 million to go towards local news funding. It's actually, when you go through it, it's not as much money as it sounds. But one of their goals is closing longstanding inequalities in journalism coverage and practice. At the same time, people who've been working in this space are warning that philanthropy doesn't have a great track record in this regard. And so, so far, BIPOC news organizations have been less likely to actually get operational dollars, and they end up getting kind of sucked up by intermediaries. And then lastly, journalism education is part of this. We're all part of this. And so there are things that we can do to keep it so students aren't having to unlearn harmful things, unlearn practices that center whiteness, even if unintentionally, or harm communities of color. And there's a real opportunity to create more accessible and inclusive training and to redefine sort of what good journalism means. Can it be inherently community-centered and anti-racist and equitable? And there's a lot of folks doing really cool things in this space already. I got to talk with some of them at an ADGMC pre-conference that we did. And people are doing great things already. I'm personally inspired by a project I've just recently started working on. I grew out of a research study on community accountability, but we've now are doing this, I'm collaborating with this organization, Day One, Not Day Two, and they're running a community fellowship program where we have fellows who are working on developing their own platform for North Philadelphia to do their own community information and stories. But then we have these paid community fellows in our class alongside Temple journalism students. So they're doing solutions journalism stories about North Philadelphia together. And it's sort of given us a model for what can non-extractive collaboration look like with community members and how to create more accountable student journalism as well. And so they're able to learn from each other. So with all this work, I think for me, the key thing that I try to keep thinking about is there's not going to be a moment where we'll be able to say, okay, we've done that. We've achieved anti-racist journalism. There's always going to be a need for accountability infrastructure. And I think for me, it's helpful to think about, what can equitable processes and infrastructure be, not projects or not destinations so much. And, remembering to think about these not only within a news organization, but between them and communities. Because, structural shifts are what we need. Good intentions isn't going to do it. And, people's roles change, people's jobs change. And so if you don't have systems in place, suddenly you might be relying on goodwill that does not exist anymore. So there's a whole lot of work to be done. I'm eager to hear your thoughts and ideas and talk. And I'm sorry, I feel like I talked for a million years now and I'm going to stop.
Hey, your traffic controller, what questions do you have for Andrea?
Hi, thanks so much for coming to talk with us. I'm a first year MA student here. And a lot of the recommendations seem to have as this underlying factor, this tension with like capitalism or market logic. Like having news organizations collaborate is pretty like antithetical to being like the first person to get the scoop on something. And same with doing more community-centered engagement journalists or solutions journalism. Those take more time. There's this idea that they're like less newsworthy. And I would think that part of the reason that there's not this infrastructural commitment on behalf of these news organizations is because they're really worried about their bottom line. If like they actually force, their journalists to meet a certain demographic sourcing quota or something that, they could alienate their imagined white audiences. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you're thinking of like the market logic with this, and if, because I also agree that like philanthropy isn't going to work. We need like system changes, but is it really compatible with the US economy?
Great question. You really cut to the heart of it. Yeah, racism, capitalism, the big things. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that one of my frustrations was that And part of this is like the way people talk about anti-racism. I mean, if you go back to, you know, like Black feminist conceptions of anti-racism, a lot of different conceptions of anti-racism, it's been also it's been critical of capitalism, right? And that there has to be like a combination of criticize, you know, being thoughtful about racial capitalism and the need to address that. So I think that the problem is people talk about anti-racism, but they don't talk about that part. And so like you have organizations that are very much operating within a market logic that are saying they're trying to do anti-racist work, but are not at all thinking about it in that way. And so that's led to some awkward conversations. I think that there are, yeah, I mean, absolutely, like we need to have big conversations about public funding alongside any of this work to make it viable long-term. I think that there's small openings in places that can be kind of pushed on. So like in Philadelphia, we have a pretty deep collaborative culture now of Resolve Philly started, it's rebranded as the Philadelphia gosh, they're gonna kill me for not remembering this, like the Philadelphia Journalism Collaborative or something like that. And it's, I think, 25 to 30 news organizations, I can't remember the exact number, including like big news outlets like Inquirer, HIY, TV outlets, like a few, you know, it's a real mix from large to small. But they've sort of created a space where it's expected, like collaboration is sort of seen as like how you do prestigious journalism in some ways. Or it's like how you kind of play well with each other. And there's an expectation in that system that collaboration is part of it. And so I think like there's some small openings that can be pushed on. I feel like I'm not answering part of your question, but yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard because there needs to be a conversation about what does an anti-racist business model look like. And there are people who are really thoughtful and savvy about thinking about even like if we're going to operate within the market logic, how can we challenge our assumptions about it, about who is willing to pay for things. And so you can kind of like work within the space you have while simultaneously working for public funding, working for the bigger things that are going to be longer and harder battles to fight. So, but yeah, great question.
Questions?
So I'm wondering about how when you're out in the field, like how you think about your own, not just positionality from an identity standpoint, but almost from an allegiance to certain ideals of what you want from journalism. Maybe I'm asking, how do you bite your tongue when you're hearing certain people who you're like, I don't know how that's gonna work. Like, how do you kind of approach this conversation when you kind of have an idea already about expectations and norms that you want to see in place?
Yeah, I mean, I totally take a normative stance. I'm not like, oh, I wonder what, you know, I definitely try to be pretty upfront about that. And I think, I mean, I tried, like, I guess, I don't know, are you asking partly about like how to navigate research collaborations with practitioners or?
Yeah, in a way, it's like, yeah, I mean, like you're trying to gather information for data for your book, but at the same time, you're also, you want to move towards an anti-racist journalism, and you're sort of seeing the barriers that you're talking to at times. And
Yeah.
You have to sort of negotiate that. You're gathering data, but you probably want to talk back, or you have to think about how that's going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, I end up having a lot of conversations with people who have really good intentions, but maybe are coming to a different set of practices than I think would be a way to really meet those intentions. And there is some biting of my tongue of like, just like, I want to hear you, I want to listen to you, I want to respect what you have to say, because, you know, I do think people are genuine. I do think they are like trying to do the best they can. I think there's, you know, I try to like listen to people and document it, because I think it is insightful to kind of understand how things end up being the way they are, but then circle back and have conversations about, okay, here's some ideas for doing things a little differently. And so like what, you know, I didn't talk about a lot. It's just like before I do like a book, I had a lot of conversations with people at these organizations about, okay, here's what we've learned so far. Here's some ideas. And some of those have led to things happening, and like led to different projects or like informed their work, right? Sometimes they don't agree with me and that's okay. Sometimes it goes better than others. Like I'm, you know, I'm not sure like that the door will be open to some places for me in the future, you know? But you know, I think like I'm interested in like not just understanding it, but trying to nudge it. And I'm fairly open about that. Because I mean, that's sort of just where I find my own time best spent. And I like to try to develop relationships with the people that I'm doing research kind of about in a way that feels a little bit collaborative. So it's like, okay, I know you want your organization to be better. I mean, maybe your understanding of better is a little different than mine, but let me see if I can like share information with you that could be hopefully useful for both of us. But it's challenging. I don't know, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, it's good.
My question that I was wondering, you kind of have just gotten to, but it's essentially if you could say more about the book's coming out Tuesday, what's your strategy in delivering this information, which you know is discouraging to the organizations that you studied? Like how much do they already know based on what you shared, and how do you manage the confidentiality issues, because they will recognize themselves, I'm sure, in the book.
Yeah, I don't think anything that's shocking to most people. And so like I've published some like things along the way. Like I've done like Columbia journalism review pieces or like smaller things, or like I did for Philadelphia Inquirer, we did an audit, you know, with a group of colleagues. So you know, a lot of the stuff I've kind of thought about it and put it in conversation with different things in different ways, but I don't think there's going to be great shocks to them. But what I'm hoping to do is like think about, I mean, I don't think it's not just I mean, yes, there are like some like discouraging things, but I do think like I do want to uplift and be respectful that there's a lot of people who've been working really hard and have done and have made some like real change and improvements. But what I think I want to try to do with this book is think about how can they be supported better? Like, how can we support the people who are doing this work and like give them some structural support, or at least like start conversations that can go in that direction? Because like that's what breaks my heart is when I see like great things happening and then I see like staff turnover or like some resource doesn't get continued, and then that's where it's just so sad to see progress that's been made and then the momentum, like the air goes out of the balloon. It's like what I'm interested in, like how can we think about supporting folks so that they're not so dependent on that. We'll see.
If I read the slide correctly, and I may have missed this, but your research began in 2019 and your interviews then carried over after the murder of George Floyd, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm a little like I think I started working with HYY in 2018, but yeah, close.
Oh, 2018,
Yeah.
so before and then after, at that time, it's a two-part question. There was supposedly a reckoning beginning, and so I'm assuming that there was great energy in this effort in the months after the protest around George Floyd or during that time. Bigger part of the question, though, is it feels like it has faded. That energy that emerged around the reckoning and institutions across the country were supposedly addressing these issues. And there seemed to be first a kind of a nuanced backlash, and then a more sort of formal backlash against it. You began to read articles about how this is a waste of time, how this is going to damage these institutions, how they're internally roiled by these debates and are paralyzed by it. I was just wondering, did you come across some of that, or how did that play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of that's sort of happening right now. Like maybe since the time I finished writing the book, in some ways, I think a lot has happened, but absolutely. I talk to people now who work in the DEI space who say like, oh, people think we can get back to normal now. And like, they're, you know, looking at not having, I mean, a lot of these positions that were created in 2020 or shortly thereafter were maybe created without a lot of like thought about how to support, like, you make somebody like the head of DEI, but like they're on their own and like you don't really give them clear, expectations for like what would success mean or what's, like how they're gonna be supported. And so like they often have like these really challenging situations to begin with. And then, if the organization has a challenge and has to make cutbacks, like they might get chopped or, or some of the newer people who've been hired, who might be journalists of color have lost their jobs in a lot of layoffs. So there's definitely been a sense of, we had this little moment, and for some organizations, it was only that a moment. And so, yeah, so I think there's a huge concern. And that's another thing I'm, hoping to talk about. So.
Go ahead, but
So I have a question about like a lot of the cases that you highlighted here where there's maybe some promising interesting new initiatives being developed. They're often kind of smaller, hyper local, often nonprofit. And sort of feedback to the question earlier, but I'm wondering about like how much of this is a matter of how well or like does this scale? Like when there are like successful initiatives or promising initiatives, like can this sort of community-centered journalism model that is anti-racist, can you do that at the scale of a statewide news organization? Partly it's a question of like the sort of commercial incentives of those organizations, but is it also about like how the systems of the newsroom that operate at that scale, there's sort of different undertaking than at the hyperlocal level?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I can't probably answer it to your satisfaction because I think like the question of just taking the like community-centered journalism scale, like community-centered, some of those smaller things. No, like in some ways, like scaling would probably defeat like and undermine them, because so much of it's about like how do we look just like in this community, like however you define community, however big or small it is, but you're looking really like what are their information needs and assets and making it something that responds to those directly. And so if you picked it up and plopped it somewhere else, it wouldn't really work. That said, like I think that some of the anti-racist and DEI practices that are also like thinking about community engagement and connection could be transferable to even larger organizations. And I think like I'm interested in like, for example, what Charles Crittenden's doing with having cohorts of news organizations in one place, where it has a mix of large and small organizations, and they're trying to, again, like thinking about that, like, can there be like equitable collaborative situations where you're kind of using them to pressure each other to be like good actors? And that's, I don't think, I think we don't know if that works yet or not, but I think it's something to definitely look into more.
I think it's really interesting because I think during the unrest after George Floyd's murder in the Twin Cities, we saw more collaboration between different journalism outlets. You see, an NPR reporter on TV news. There was some just odd, it wasn't odd. It was just we were also in the middle of the pandemic, and there was just more shared and collaborative sourcing. So I can imagine what that looks like. There's a lot of students in this room who are interested in becoming professional journalists, and one of the pieces I think the interesting or the hopeful pieces of your work is that you identify where there's points of intervention at different levels. So for most of us, we're not going to be managing. I mean, we might be managing a business. We've had alums, develop and try that out to figure out what more equitable coverage of communities are like. Would be like. That's Mukhtar at Sahan would be one example of that here. But and I like your conversation about the kind of meso to meso level organizations, the media kind of teaming up. That's kind of abstract, but at the individual level, your research showed that even, when journalists just internally checked themselves and kind of came up with some individual practices, that led to more diverse reporting, more diverse sourcing, stories that engaged communities perhaps more, or different communities that hadn't been represented. Can you talk to that a little bit more? Like what are the tools that student journalists should be thinking?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think. I appreciate that there is, I don't want to be doom and gloom on this. And I see it like even just like in classes that I've done where we've talked about some of these things and talked about, okay, let's, we're gonna work together to come up with a source tracking thing that's gonna work for, so we did, and I have a class right now where we're doing a content audit of our student newspaper. But then the students are thinking about how they can kind of track their own people, who are they talking to in their stories? How are they framing their stories in their own work? And I think there's a lot of fairly, I mean, not super complicated things that you can do that aren't necessarily adding tons and tons of time to your work, but are just sort of focusing you to be a little bit more reflexive. And there's some really good resources out there. Mentioning Resolvability again, they have a good like a framing that they have something called Reframe, or I think it's called Modifier now, where they have like this really simple questions you can ask of your stories about like how you're framing things in your stories. Who are you centering in your stories? Different kinds of ways of just sometimes simple questions can get you to just think a little bit more carefully about your own reporting. But just having the practice as like normalizing the practice of like, okay, I'm gonna like keep track of who I'm talking to and maybe have a conversation with my editor if I need a little bit more time to make sure that I'm, having a good representation of people in the community in the story. And obviously that also involves the editors. There's an issue there, but there are things that you can do individually. There are ways you can like just show up in community spaces and develop relationships, use some community organizing strategies to allow you to just do better reporting, but do it in a way that's kind of taking your cues more from communities. So I think there are tons of things that as individual reporters you can do. And it's just a matter of like, doing the best you can in wherever the situation is that you have. And then hopefully also kind of working on some of these bigger pieces at the same time.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wenzel. One more round of applause. In 100, just down the hall, you're all invited.
Are you
No,
you're done with the performance? You met that, it's okay, that's nice. Good luck. Be good.